Hi, everyone. My name is Anaïs Remili. I am a French postdoctoral researcher at McGill University in Montreal in Canada. And I study killer whales and toxicology. So it's called ecotoxicology. Basically, it's the link between the ecology and contaminants in marine mammals. Diet of North Atlantic killer whales varies quite a lot. So in Norway and Iceland, killer whales seem to prefer herring, so that was good because it really matched what we were seeing from the boat. And in Iceland, we were able to find that some individuals also eat marine mammals. So for example, harbor porpoise or harbor seal. These individuals that consume a lot of marine mammals were the individuals that we know traveled to Scotland. And these killer whales were identified in Iceland, but they were also photographed in Scotland. And we know that in Scotland, they feed on seals, and then they come back to Iceland and they feed on herring with the other Icelandic killer whales. We also saw that in different parts of the North Atlantic, killer whales eat marine mammals. For example, in Greenland, they eat a lot of different Arctic seals. In the Canadian Arctic, they eat ring seals as well as belugas and narwhals. And then we looked at the contaminants inside their blubber. We were able to find a really strong link between the diet of the killer whales and how much contaminants were in their blubber. And so what we found is that the killer whales that eat fish, so like herring, so in Norway and Iceland, have less contaminants in their blubber than the killer whales that eat seals and other marine mammals, like other cetaceans like belugas, narwhals, harbor porpoises, etc. Diet seemed to be the biggest factor in these pollutant differences. We found that overall, Icelandic killer whales are doing somewhat okay with the contaminants if they only eat fish. But we found that the killer whales that have a mixed diet in Iceland, so those are the ones that also feed on marine mammals, so like harbor porpoise and harbor seal on top of herring, have much higher levels of contaminants. And that actually puts them above the safe limits. Killer whales face so many more threats because these contaminants accumulate along the food web. And so killer whales being at the top of the food web, they accumulate everything that's been magnifying through the food web. And so killer whales are actually at risk from these contaminants and can threaten their immune system. It can threaten their reproductive system. And so to me, that was a big goal. It was to study a species that actually really needed help from these chemical pollutants. The model that we developed during my PhD is called quantitative fatty acid signature analysis. So it's a mouthful, but we call it QFASA for short. And it is a model that reconstitutes the diet of killer whales using the fat in their blubber and the fat in potential prey species. It all relies on this concept that we are what we eat. And so if a killer whale feeds on a herring, it will integrate the fat from the herring into its own blubber. But if a killer whale ate a seal, it will integrate the fat from the seal into its own blubber. And we're able to differentiate between those two by looking at the fat composition in the killer whale and in the different potential prey that they feed on. And so then using statistics and a modeling approach, so all on the computer, we can estimate the most likely proportion of different prey in the diet of individual. The contaminants that we study are called persistent organic pollutants. They're chemicals that actually came from human activities. The most famous are called polychlorinated biphenyls, call them PCB, were invented in the 1930s, and they were developed in the industry, and we use them kind of everywhere, stabilizers, in paints, in plastics, etc. So they were very helpful. But then we realized that these contaminants actually end up in the environment. Chemically speaking, they have a very strong affinity with fat. Accumulate in the marine organism. And so all these contaminants that are attached to the fat in the prey get transferred to the next level. And so let's say that a seal has been eating a lot of fish that was already having these little contaminants in it, so these little PCBs. The seal gets all the PCBs from the fish, plus the PCBs are already in the water. So it creates like a amplifying effect for these contaminants. We also have some pesticides. So for example, DDT. We have chloridins, which is another type of pesticide. And these pesticides were doing an amazing job when they were used because they were killing all the pests. But then we realized that once they get sprayed into the fields, they go down with the water into the rivers, and then from the rivers, they enter the ocean. And then because they bind to fat, they enter the bodies of marine organisms. And then they get passed along the food web and they end up in marine mammals. And marine mammals have a lot of fat because they need to stay warm in cold waters. And so they accumulate a lot of these contaminants. And then they can't really get rid of them because these contaminants are very stable from a chemical perspective. And so it's very hard to break down the molecule of the contaminant. And so they'll just stick to the fat in the blubber and they'll keep accumulating like this throughout their entire life. One thing that is important to know is that most of these contaminants today are banned from production. So this is good news because for the most part, we're not going to release more of these pesticides. But there is an issue. There are many contaminated waste that still include these contaminants. So for example, PCBs used in coolants and electrical components, in paint and plastic, etc. And we still have contaminated waste that includes those PCBs. And so we have all this contaminated waste that's sitting in random warehouses here and there. And we run into the risk of having a problem happen to a warehouse and having all these contaminants leach back into the environment. And if anything happens to those, they can re-enter the environment. But we can also ask our governments to take care of future contaminants, new contaminants. So for example, we have PFAS, the things that's in Teflon, and that's causing problems in marine organisms today. So that's something that we can ban further and make sure that no new contaminants re-enter production. So we need to include proper testing before we release any new compounds into the market. But as individuals, what we could do is to make sure we don't spray any harsh pesticides on our yards to control for pests. We can make sure to use dishwasher, detergent, etc. that's free of any bad chemicals, so as neutral as possible for the environment. Killer whales and other marine mammals are not just facing pollution. It's not a single issue. They are also facing plastic pollution, they're facing noise pollution from boat traffics, they're facing entanglement threats, let's say by the big fisheries, they can get caught in the nets, they can face a lack of prey. So that's a different range of threats, and pollution is just one aspect of that. But there's many things that we can do as individuals to make sure that, first of all, we don't overpollute our Earth, and second, that we take care of the other threats as well. So making sure that the killer whales have enough to eat, making sure that we control how much fish we can take so that they don't starve, making sure that we don't release plastic bags into the environment, because that's another threat that gets on top of everything else, and making sure that we don't drive our boats too fast because that creates a lot of noise and that can also impact how they hunt for fish. So that's so many things that we can do as individuals, and it helps to target each different little threat that they cumulatively face as marine mammals.